Using the built-in help and updating a brand new installation. There's a lot of times that you and I are going to be at the command line, about to type in a command and think to ourselves, what was the syntax for that again? Wouldn't it be great if there's some kind of an online or built-in help that could assist us? The answer is there is. In this video, we're going to take a look at exactly how to leverage that and how to keep our system up to date with the latest software. Let's begin. I still remember when I was younger, somebody shared with me a quote. It went something like, if you give a person a fish, they'll eat for a day. If you teach them how to fish, they could eat for a lifetime. And I remember thinking back at the time I first heard that, I thought, well, what if they live in the desert? Now, with a little more wisdom and time under my belt, I realized the importance of that concept. So how exactly does that apply to us in the world of Backtrack? Well, we're running on top of a Linux distribution, and there's a lot of commands that are just native to Unix, and there's also a lot of commands that are specific for the Backtrack tools that we'll be learning. And one of the ways that we can learn how to fish is realize that there are documentation inside of the operating system for lots of the commands that we'll be dealing with. For example, let's say there's a command called apt-get, which we'll get to in just a moment, and we wanted to know more details about the program called apt-get. We could type in man space the word apt-get, press enter, and that'll bring up the manuals, the man pages, if you will, on that topic. And you can use the arrow to scroll through them and read as much as you want. So the next step is, let's say we know what the command does, but we're not sure of the actual syntax, the options and the parameters that need to follow that command. We could type in the actual command itself, and many of the commands, if you just type them in and press enter, they'll know that they're missing parameters, and they'll give you a list of the valid options and parameters that you can enter. For some commands, you might have to add a -h or a -help or a -help. So usually, one of these options is going to give you the syntax help at the CLI, that's the command line interface at the Linux box, and the man pages will give you the full documentation regarding that command. Another really cool thing that's going to help you and I quite a bit in this Nugget series is updating our software. Now, apt-get, the advanced package tool, the apt-get program will give us the option of downloading updates and then installing those updates, which is fantastic. And I would strongly recommend, if you're going through this series with me step by step, I'm going to go ahead and run this here in a moment. I'll demo that because I want the software that I'm running to be identical to the software you're running. That way, all the commands, the switches, and the syntax should be virtually identical if you want to mirror these exercises. So let's take a look at using apt-get, but before we run that, let's go ahead and take a look at the man pages for it. To bring up the man pages, you simply type in man space, the name of the program, you press enter. Down here at the bottom, it's indicating where we are, and you can use the arrow key to simply scroll up and down. So here's the apt-get command. It has boatloads of different options, including an option that says update, which is pretty cool right here. Now, after we do the update, we can then do the upgrade, which will actually install that newest version of software. And it is a general recommendation that we update periodically just to keep current. One of the challenges is, okay, how do I get out of these man pages? And the way you get out is with the letter Q, as in quiet. Just hit the Q key on your keyboard, and that will take you right back to the CLI. So let's say we want to run apt-get, and we're thinking, oh, I just read the man pages, but what was that syntax again to actually implement it? We just type in apt-get space -help. You can also just type in apt-get, press enter, and it will say, oh, you forgot something, and it gives you the help screen for it. So this right here is help on help, saying the -h brings up help for apt-get. So here's some commands that we just looked at in the man pages. We've got the update, and we've also got upgrade, and a boatload of other options that are available as parameters associated with the apt-get command. Now, in a previous nugget, we already verified that name resolution was working. We also verified that internet connectivity was working. So let's go ahead and do an update. We are going to need live access to get this done. So we'll do an apt-get space update, press enter. So now that we've done the update, let's go ahead and run the apt-get with the upgrade option to take any of these packages where there's a newer version available and have it go ahead and install that newer version for us. So to do that, we'll just use apt-get one more time, except this time we'll use the upgrade option and press return. So it's provided us a little summary, and now it's asking for permission to go ahead and do it. I'm going to type in Y for yes and press enter. Now this update could take quite a while, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pause the recording, and when it's done, before I type in anything extra, at the CLI on the Backtrack machine, I will go ahead and pick the recording back up and we'll continue on together. So it is complete. Now, behind the scenes, that was about 30 minutes of clock time between the time I started with the actual upgrade until it said I'm completely done downloading all the software and installing it. In this video, you and I have taken a look at the concept of learning how to fish. What I'm talking about is learning how to use the help that is right at our fingertips. The man pages are terrific. If we issue a command and then use one of these options at the end, it's very likely that command is going to give us the syntax for completing that command. We also looked at getting our systems current by using apt-get. Now, to put all these together, here's what I'd like you to do. Now, a few videos ago, we took a look at installing Backtrack. I hope you've done that as practice. We also took a look in another video at connecting to the network and configuring an IP address. What I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to practice all of these options with apt-get. So, for example, on your Backtrack system, type in apt-get space and then maybe a -h for help. Or go ahead and use the man pages for it. Type in man space apt-get. And remember, when you get into the man pages to get out, you just hit Q. The letter Q on your keyboard exits out of the man page and puts you back at the command line interface. The last thing I'd love for you to do is go ahead and use apt-get to update your system. So to use apt-get, it's apt-get space, that's my little character for a space, update, and then apt-get again, another space, and upgrade. And you will absolutely want to make sure that you have name resolution working for internet resources and internet connectivity for these steps. Otherwise, it won't be possible for it to download the list and download the software to bring your system up to speed. Another benefit of doing this at this point is that any of the commands that we're going to be doing together and the penetration testing and the attacks and everything else that we're going to be doing together, if you and I are on the exact same version of those tools, it'll be a lot easier for you to replicate exactly what you see me do in these nuggets. I'm having a great time. I'm glad you joined me. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing. Wireless transmission power in Backtrack. Before we jump into any analysis of our wireless networks, it'd be really important for us to, if we need to, tweak the actual transmit signal strength in our Backtrack system. In this nugget, we're going to take a look at how to verify and change exactly that. Let's begin. I'd like you to imagine that you and I have just installed a Backtrack system. The Ethernet's great, works like a champ, the wired. We've also done the update and that went good. And now we want to start working with wireless. One of the things we just want to be aware of is that we can alter or manipulate the signal strength on the adapter in the Backtrack machine. Depending on the country that you live in, there's very likely a regulatory agency that's controlling the airwaves. What do you mean, Keith, controlling? Well, let's take an example. Let's take FM radio or AM radio. If you tune into your favorite station, you're looking to hear whatever that station is broadcasting. You're not going to be looking for 5 or 6 different people broadcasting on that same exact frequency. Well, in the world of wireless for computer networks, we have a couple of ranges of frequency. We have a 2.4 and a range of frequencies in that space. And up at 5 gigahertz, we have another range of frequencies. But just because they're open and available and we don't have to register with anybody to use them, there's still some guidelines on how much signal strength we can use when we transmit on these frequencies. So here's what I've discovered. On a Backtrack system that has an alpha card, I've seen normally the default set to 20. And this is dBm, which equates to about 100 milliwatts. So if we wanted a stronger signal on our Backtrack device to transmit, we could go ahead and potentially raise this up higher. I think the maximum in the United States that we can go is like 27 dBm, which would be about half a watt, 500 milliwatts. And then if we cranked it all the way up to 30 dBm, that would be 1 full watt of power, which, depending on where you live, that may or may not be legal. Now, a couple things. I certainly am not encouraging anybody to do anything outside the scope of what is totally legal. So let's say you do live in a country where it is legal to set this to 30. I also want to point out that your hardware, the actual wireless adapter, would have to support that as well. And if you start using more signal strength, there's going to be more heat, and there's a risk of possibly damaging some circuitry. So even if you could crank this all the way up to some really high number, you want to make sure two things. Number one, you're not breaking any laws. Number two, you're not going to damage your equipment. Another idea that I've seen people toy with is, well, maybe we change the country code. We tell our computer and Backtrack and the wireless device that we're in a different country where it's legal to have those higher rates, and then we could use that. Well, again, the goal is you want to be legal for whatever you're doing. If you're doing penetration testing for a network, you would want authorization for that. And if we're going to be working with the airwaves, it would be best to stay legal within the legal realm of what we're allowed to do in our country. So if we did want to change the country code, let's say we are going to a country where we can actually crank that value up, we want to change the country code, and we could do that by, here's the ISO listing of the country codes. So I believe the maximum I could set it for, if I set my country code for US, would be 27 dBm. And also, just be aware that people use different frequencies potentially in different countries. So if I want to work with my 2.4 range with channels 1 through 11 and the overlapping sets, I would want to make sure that the country code was right so I could participate on the frequencies that are going to be used by that network. So the actual country code is sort of like a throttler that once you set the country code, which has the right ranges, it also is going to control, based on that country code, the maximum dBm that we can set the interface transmission level to. So let's start. I've got 4 SSH sessions open to the same Backtrack server. Now, why would I do that? The primary reason is I wanted the visual real estate with a bigger font and make it really easy for you and I both to see everything that's going to go ahead and happen. And what I'd like to do is have a one screen. I've got 4 sessions. One of these sessions, I'd like to go ahead and use tail. Now, tail will redirect output from a file to the screen. And now if we need more help on the actual tail command, how could we get it? Well, it's simple. We simply type in man space tail, and that's going to give us the manual, the man pages on this program called tail. We'll press enter, and it simply says, okay, it's going to go ahead and print the last 10 lines of each file to standard output with more than one file, proceed, blah, 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 with a whole bunch of options there. So what I'd like to do in this window, I'd like to use the tail program and have it read in a file. And this is going to be our messages file from a log folder. And by doing this, we can see any new messages that come in. Now, the N refers to number of lines. The default is the last 10 lines. I don't want to see the last 10 lines. I just want to have a live feed of any new messages that show up in this file. So now, any events that happen based on configuration changes we make, we can go back to tab 1, this one, and take a look at them right here. Another tool that I like to use is called IW. Now, how would we get help for that? Well, let's take a look at the man pages for that as well. With man space IW. And this is a command that lets us work with and change the properties of wireless devices. So that's the IW command. And to get out of this man page, I'm going to hit Q to exit out. And we're going to be using the IW command to change our transmit levels for the wireless radio in this Backtrack device. The next thing that you and I ought to do is we ought to shut down the wireless LAN 0 interface in the event that we want to just demonstrate changing the country code and setting the actual level higher than 27. So if the interface is turned off, it's down, it won't be sending any signals and we'll be in the clear. And it probably is already by default, but I'm going to go ahead and set my country code to US just to make sure that it's where it should be. And with that, it should allow the default standard channels here in the United States for the 2.4 gigahertz range. It also should restrict me from setting my dBm level higher than 27. Before we make any changes, let's just go ahead and use the iwconfig command just to verify where we're at. And this says right here that we're currently at 20 dBm, which if we go back to our chart, that was like 100 milliwatts of power for transmit signal. So let's change it. Let's set it up to 27, which I believe is the max. So we'll do iwconfig, WLAN 0, transmit power 27. We'll run iwconfig again, just see what it is, and it comes up as 27. So there's the direct comparison. That's fantastic. So still within our legal range, but we're increasing the transmit power for this wireless interface. So just to be sure, let's go ahead and try to set the transmit power to 28 and see if it takes that or not. So we'll do iwconfig, WLAN 0, TX power 28. It says, oh, sorry, that's a bad argument. That's not going to work, that 28. Now, if we change the rules a little bit, if we said, oh, let's use the country code of Bolivia, for example, which allows higher than 27, it should work. So over here in this window, we have our tail running on the messages file. So any new messages show up should come to this screen here. So let's go ahead and change that for a moment. And again, the radio is turned off. So we'll set it to country code of BO, and if we look over at this, that icon changed, So it took that change. Let's go ahead and see if we can change the transmit power to something higher than 27. So we'll make a road trip back over to our main console that we're working with, and we'll say iwconfig wireless LAN 0, transmit power 28. Didn't complain this time, and just to verify, we'll go ahead and take a look at it with just an iwconfig. So now it's set to 28. Now it's very likely very likely that the channels are not exactly the same as they are here in the States, so I'm not sure how usable this would be. But I wanted to give you an example of what controls that setting, and I also want to remind you that it's up to the actual hardware. Now this Alpha card, I believe, is capable of doing a full milliwatt, which means we could set this to 30 and it would still operate. You'd want to be careful and not melt down your interface card as well, because the more power you send through something, the more heat, and if the circuits can't take it, you might cause some damage. Nobody wants that either. Now the interface has been shut down, so we're not actually doing transmission because we are going to be using this wireless interface. Let's go ahead and set it back to its defaults. I want to go ahead and set the transmit power back to 20, which is 100 milliwatts. And I'm also going to bring the interface up. And that may take just a second for the interface to respond and to go ahead and bring itself up out of a shutdown state. And so we'll wait for it. And there it is. The other thing I think we ought to do is set the country code back to US, because we are going to be working with frequencies and the channels here in the US in these demos anyway. So I want to make sure I don't mess my own self up there by having the wrong country code. And just to verify it's all back in shape, we'll do a ifconfig for wireless LAN interface 0, and it looks like it's up and good to go. In this nugget, we've had the opportunity to verify what our signal strength is, and we've identified the commands to change it with the iwconfig command. Your homework assignment, should you choose to accept it, is within the regulations for wherever you are in the world. I'd like you to modify your signal strength. So if you don't know what it is, find out, do the iwconfig, see what it is, and maybe set it to 1 lower. That'll be safe. And then you can set it back to 1 higher. My goal for you is simple, is to have you practice with those commands so that if you ever need to change that signal strength for whatever reason, you'll have some experience doing it before the moment you need to do it. I've had a great time with you in this nugget. I appreciate you joining me. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing. Discovering access points that are supposedly using hidden service set identifiers. This is a fun one and super easy. Let's begin. I'd like you to imagine that you and I are at work, and one of our coworkers comes up with a story about a side job that he had. And that side job involved a customer who needed an access point, a wireless access point. Now, as many of you already know, an SSID, the service set identifier, is what's broadcast by the access point. So a user would turn on their computer, they'd see a list of all the broadcasted SSIDs, they'd pick one and then associate it with it. Well, for security reasons, our friend told us, what he did was he trained the access point not to advertise the SSID. This sounds like a great idea. That way the users who need it were given the information on what that SSID is. They could manually configure that and join. While at the same time, hopefully, the attackers wouldn't realize the access point even existed because it wasn't broadcasting the SSID and wasn't as visible. Well, that's a great idea. It's a great concept of security through obscurity by not advertising the SSID. But does that mean a person who wants to find out if there's an access point won't be able to? The answer is no. It's very, very simple to discover a hidden or non-broadcast SSID. It's really basically 3 things we're going to do. Number 1 is we're going to enable monitoring mode on our wireless interface. We're going to turn on AirDump to go ahead and see exactly what access points are out there. And we'll see one or more that isn't broadcasting an SSID, but it still has its MAC address. It'll still show up. Now, we can do one of 2 things at that point. We can just wait. And as individuals and machines associate with that access point, we'll collect the actual SSID name from the probes that happen during that process. However, if we don't want to wait, we can go ahead and do a deauthentication attack against the network, and that will cause all the clients who are currently associated to reassociate, which will also provide us with the SSID of that access point. So to do this, I just rebooted or brought up for this nugget our backtrack system that we've been using. I'm going to log on as root with the password of TOOR. And hopefully we've got that same static address, the one we configured previously. And there it is, 192.168.1.222. And that is for our wired connection inside of this backtrack. We still have the Alpha card that's available as our wireless interface. Because SSH is still running, we configured it to be persistent across reboots. I'm going to go ahead and open up a couple of SSH sessions to the IP address of this box just to give us a slightly bigger font for the demonstrations. So let's take a look at what interfaces we have to deal with just to make sure nothing changed since the last reboot. So I've got Ethernet 0, it's the LAN Ethernet connection wired. I've got my loopback interface, and I also have wireless LAN 0. Fantastic. Next, let's just run airmon ng just without any parameters whatsoever, just to verify that it's able and willing to recognize that as a wireless card. Our next step is simple. We want to tell it to start listening or monitoring on that wireless interface. To do that, it's really simple. It's airmon-ng space start, and then the interface name of our wireless interface. And it's good to go right there. So now we have this new logical interface called mon0 that we can start listening on. Just to verify that, I'm going to type in airmon-ng one more time just to verify that both interfaces now show up. The physical interface, the wireless interface, and the logical monitoring interface. It looks like we're really good to go. Now our goal is to discover what is the wireless service set identifier for an access point that's hiding it, that's not open to the public. Before we actually turn on some tools to actually see what that information is, let me bring over a Windows tool just for a moment. This is Insider, INSSIDER 2.1, and it's just looking at the airwaves, listening for access point, who's out there. And if you'll notice, it's got Barker, which is on my home network, and it's got several others. It's got one called Weak Sauce at 2.4 gigahertz range. If you go to the 5 gigahertz channels, I've got a Weak Sauce there, and also this other one up here. So these are the only networks that are showing up. Now, anybody who isn't advertising their SSID wouldn't show up on a normal computer that's browsing and looking for an access point. That's one of the benefits of turning off the broadcasting, is that the casual observer will not notice that there's an access point present. So let me move this out of the way, and let's go ahead and turn on AirDump and have it start listening to all the access points that the backtrack machine can see through the wireless mon0 interface. So the command up to this point has been airmon, and now we're going to cut over to using airdump. And the syntax is airdump-ng space and the monitoring interface that we want it to pay attention to. I'd like you to pay attention up here at the top left-hand corner. It's cycling through various channels looking for all the access points it can find. And what we're looking for is we're looking for one of them in the far right over here that isn't displaying an SSID. And if you'll notice, it has Barker and then Weak Sauce and a few others. But this one right here, it says length 0. That's the one that's hiding out. So let's do this. I'm going to go ahead and do a Control-C to stop that just for a moment. Let's annotate this. So this is the guy that's hiding out right there. And there's his MAC address of the access point in measurable terms. So if we wanted to discover what that is, this is so embarrassing, all we have to do is sit here and wait long enough. We could just sit here. And what would happen is we would go ahead and discover after a period of time, after people start associating with that access point, it would show up either down here or down here with whatever that name is of the actual access point itself. Because there's some communication that goes on when devices are associating with that access point, people who know what the actual SSID is, that actually gives it away. A couple other things we know is that they're not doing any type of encryption on that access point. And I also, just to point out, this is my own lab here. This is my gear that we're working with. I'm not hacking into anybody else's access point, just for demonstration purposes only. And it's on channel 1. So what we could do is we could go ahead and run airdump again. And this time say, you know what? Forget about everybody else. Let's just focus on channel number 1, because that's where this access point is. So we can narrow it down in the event we have dozens or hundreds of potential access points all taking up real estate on our screen. So let's do exactly that. We're going to use airdump again, except this time we're going to add the -C for channel. And I'm going to say channel 1 and specifically on mon0. We'll press enter. And now it's just listening for channel 1. It looks like we have a little bit that snuck through right here. I'm going to pause the screen just for a moment so I can draw on it. So right here, this says 3, but I think they're overlapping to channel 1 as well. That's why it's picking up. So up here is specifying we're looking at channel 1 specifically. And we still have this guy right here that's showing up. So there's his access point MAC address, and we don't have his SSID being broadcast, but we're about to discover what that is. So as I mentioned, we could just let it sit here and wait for devices to associate with that access point. And case in point, I'm going to keep this real time. I've got another computer here in my lab. I'm just going to bring him up, and he happens to be sitting on that network associated with that access point. So in the background, if I typed in the SSID correctly, that is working, and check it out. See how it just showed up right there, sneaky-SSID? So now that we know what the SSID is here, and we also see that it's open encryption, meaning there's no encryption being set on it, it wouldn't take a whole lot of effort for virtually anyone to join that network now that we know the SSID. The other thing I'd like to share with you is, what if you don't want to wait? What if you don't want to wait for a bunch of computers to associate with that access point before you get that data? Maybe we're in a hurry. Well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave this running. Let me open up a separate window. I'm going to right click. This is secure CRT, by the way. I just have SSH sessions. I'm going to clone this session. I've already got the password cache to log in as root with the password of Tor. And let's go ahead and use a third tool that's going to force a deauthentication of everybody associated with that access point. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to pump some deauthentication messages pretending to come from the actual access point itself out to the network. And we're going to need this MAC address. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this. Control C. We can go ahead and copy this MAC address, and then we can use it as part of our error replay attack. And what it'll do, it'll force everybody who's connected to that access point to go ahead and reassociate with the access point, which will give us the probe information that we need to learn the SSID. And again, that's if we didn't want to wait the time it took for another device to associate with that hidden SSID. So let's do this. Let's go back. I guess we could do it from any tab we want to. We can do it right here as well now too. And let's go ahead and simply do error replay. We'll do a -0, which is a deauthentication attack. We'll repeat it twice. I'll go ahead and put the -A, which represents the MAC address of the access point, and I'll specify the interface that I want to go ahead and do this from, which is Mon0. And what that should do, it should go out and send exactly two deauthentication messages to the network, and everybody who's connected to that access point should, in the background on their PCs, reassociate, which would give us the information that we need. So we had this program right here running, the AirDump NG on channel 1. In fact, let's do it live right here. So let's say we don't want to wait for a device to reassociate with that access point. We'll go to another window over here, and we'll simply say what we want to do is, let's go ahead and do the deauthentication attack. So the deauthentication attack is running. Well, actually, it will be once I press enter. And now that it's running, we'll go back here, and the sneaky SSID appears because we saw the probe messages that included that information. In this nugget, we've taken a look at using the tool AirMon to turn on our wireless listening capabilities on our wireless interface adapter. Then we used AirDump to go ahead and start displaying to the screen the access points that were seen by our wireless interface. And really, that's all we have to do. Step 1, step 2, and a little patience, and you'll see the hidden SSIDs pop up. Now, if you're not patient and you don't want to wait for at least one device to associate with the SSID that's currently hidden from everybody else, we could do a deauth attack, which is what we did with the error replay. And by using the MAC address of the access point and saying we want to send 2 deauth packets, that will force devices who are currently associated with that access point to reassociate, which will give us that information we need about the SSID that was previously hidden from our eyes. Just as a quick reminder, in our Nugget series together, you and I, all these tests that we're doing are done on a private network where I'm authorized to use these tools. I want to make sure you have the same precautions. Please make sure that wherever you use these tools, you are authorized to do so. Now, having said that, I would very much like you to practice with these tools. Number 1, I'd like you to use AirMon and put your wireless adapter into listening mode, and then start dumping the information to the screen. And if you want to practice, a great way to do it is get your own access point that you manage and bring it up in a network that you're authorized to do that, and then specify in the software of that access point that you don't want to broadcast the SSID. Once you've done that, brought it up, maybe bring up a couple computers, verify that they can't see through normal tools the actual SSIDs, and then go ahead and use the AirMon and AirDump and see if you can't discover what that is. It doesn't take very long on a network that has several clients for that to show up all by itself, but just to put icing on the cake, I would also encourage you to practice with error replay to do the deauth attack to make that information come to the screen that much quicker. I'm glad you joined me. I've had a lot of fun in this nugget. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing. Bypassing MAC address filters on an access point. This is another fun one. I'm glad you've joined me. Let's begin. Our objective in this nugget is really simple, is to identify how we can bypass, if we need to, wireless MAC filtering on an access point. So in an earlier nugget, our friend came to us and talked to us about not broadcasting the SSID, and through that nugget, we also identified how simple it is to discover what that SSID is. So it's not very secure just hiding it. Well, he also told us, well, I didn't just hide the SSID, I also did MAC address filtering, he tells us. And I listed all the machines, their wireless network cards, the MAC addresses in the access point, and told the access point, deny all access except for this list of MAC addresses. So now that he has two levels, or sort of levels, of security, what's the problem with that? Well, I first want to point out that taking steps towards security is better than no security at all. Unfortunately, it's also very easy to get around MAC filtering. The three basic steps involved are: number one, find out the MAC address and the channel that the access point is on. Secondly, find out the MAC address that the client is using who's successfully associated with that access point because he is on the good list. For example, his MAC address is a winner. It's on that list of MAC addresses that can be used, and we're just going to borrow it. We're not going to take it forever, but we are going to borrow that MAC address using a tool called MAC Changer. So if the MAC address filtering list on the access point says, MAC address A, B, C, D, E, F are all good, we'll just become one of those MAC addresses and associate with the access point. Now, how do we go about demonstrating this? Well, we're going to log on first. So I'm going to log on as root. Default password is tour. We'll take a look at changing that in another nugget. But for now, we're good. Also, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and bring up an SSH session. The primary reason for me using SSH is simply get a larger font. So for text-based commands like the ones we're using, I'm only doing it so it's more readable. You can do exactly the same commands right at the command line of the actual backtrack without using SSH. For this demonstration, I've got an access point. It's the one that we used in the previous nugget where we discovered the SSID. As you may recall, it has no encryption whatsoever. And I also included, since the last nugget, I included a MAC address filter so that only specific MAC addresses are allowed. The MAC address of this backtrack system, its wireless card, is not currently on that list. So let's start the party. We're going to use Airmon start and reference my wireless network card, which hasn't changed. It's still wireless LAN 0. And look at that. So let's do an IF config just to make sure my machine can see it. And it can't. It cannot see that wireless adapter whatsoever. To fix that, let's go ahead and do an IF config WLAN 0 up. And that device is not showing up. Wow. All right. So the reality is, because it's not showing up, it's going to be tough to use. Now, when we set this up in one of our earlier nuggets, this backtrack system is in a virtual machine. So at this point, what I would do, what I'm going to do, is I'm going to check my VirtualBox settings just to make sure that that wireless network adapter is still allocated and associated with this virtual machine. So to do this, let me bring open the VirtualBox Manager. This is the machine we're working with right here. I'm going to click on Settings, and we'll go down to USB. It's still loading in, and sure enough, it's there. Okay, so that is the actual adapter. It is not showing up as a valid interface. So here, let's do this. I'm going to minimize that. I'm going to disconnect from the USB port this alpha adapter. I heard a little noise. That's great. And I'm going to plug it back in. And I also want to verify and see if that magically had it come back. That would be awesome if it did. I'm not expecting it. This may require a reboot to get that going. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to simply reboot backtrack. So let me go ahead and close my SSH session, get that out of the way. Bring up backtrack native, and we'll simply do a power off now. I could have also done a reboot, I suppose, at the same time, but I'm going to just power it down. The USB is connected, and I'm going to go ahead and bring it back up with the hope that that USB device shows up. One of the thoughts that went through my head was, I'm just going to edit all this out, not share with them anything. But the reality is, stuff does happen. A device may not show up, especially in a virtual environment. So I'm just going through the same troubleshooting steps that I would if no one was watching. So I'm glad you're here. Let's reboot that and see if that wireless adapter shows up. So here's my VirtualBox Manager. That's our machine in question. We'll boot it up, and hopefully that interface will be available. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty tough to listen on the network for other devices and other access points if we don't have a wireless interface ourselves. All right, so right here we'll do a root. And once it says we're honky-dory, we'll do an IF config just to verify we have our wireless LAN interface showing up. And there it is. Magical. I did two things. I actually unplugged the wireless adapter, plugged it back in. The running backtrack in the virtual machine didn't see it. I then just rebooted it. I did nothing else, and there's our wireless adapter. So now we can start using it. All right, my friend. Thanks for joining me on that detour. It was fun. Now that we have the wireless adapter that Backtrack has to use, let's go ahead and turn on monitoring mode. So we're going to do an airmon-ng start for wireless LAN 0. That looks a lot better. And you notice right here, we now have this logical mon 0 that we can use to listen to the airwaves. And now if this adapter, by the way, is in the 2.4 gigahertz range. So if there's 5 gigahertz signals I'm looking for, I would need to have a wireless network card that Backtrack can use that could listen on that frequency range. So let's see who's out there chatting. So we're going to use AeroDump and tell it to use mon 0. And it's going through the channel. So in the upper left-hand corner, it's cycling through the channels, listening. We have the MAC addresses under the BSSID on the top left. And then we have the ESSID, the name, if you will, the SSID name on the right. So we still have this guy. I'm going to pause the screen just for a minute so I can draw on it. So right there, that's our hidden SSID. That's the MAC address. That's the one with no encryption whatsoever at the moment. And that's the one we want to get. So we're going to keep track of this one. This is also, by the way, the access point that currently has the MAC address filtering list that this Backtrack machine is not on. So let me unpause that. And again, we shouldn't have to do too much of anything to discover that missing or hidden SSID. In fact, if we just wait for a client or two to go ahead and associate, that will pop up. And there it goes. So now we have this SSID that we knew from earlier. We also have the MAC address. Let's also take a look at the channel. Currently it is on channel 4, which is a little bit different. In our previous nugget, that guy I thought was on channel 1. In any event, he's on channel 4 now. And now all we need to do is find a client who is currently associated with that access point and then borrow that MAC address, and we'll be in. One thing I like about watching like the food channel or a cooking show is the before and after. So what I'd like to do is before we actually join and associate this SSID as a client, let's go ahead first of all and verify that we can't. And then we can take a look at the difference after we borrow a MAC address. So how do we actually tell Backtrack that we want to associate with a specific access point? The answer is simple. We simply say with IWconfig, I want my wireless LAN 0 interface to associate with sneaky-SSID, and it's on channel 4. And it's done. So, well,